And now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lee Ann Jung. Lee Ann is the founder and CEO of Lead Inclusion, a small company that provides professional trainings, courses, and consulting to teachers and schools. She and her team provide support to schools in the areas of universal design for learning, inclusion, intervention, and mastery-based assessment and grading. In her 30 years in the field of education, Lee Ann has been in the roles of teacher, administrator, researcher, consultant, and professor. She's a clinical professor at San Diego State University and a consultant to schools worldwide. Lee Ann is a former full professor and director of international partnerships at University of Kentucky. She's the author of 7 books, numerous journal articles and book chapters, and has served as associate editor and editorial board member for several professional publications. So without further ado, I am going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Lee Ann.
Well, hello, everybody. I was going to say good afternoon, but we're from all over the world. How exciting. I used to consider myself a special educator. Now I would say I'm an inclusive educator. And the most rewarding work that I get to do is when I'm in schools working side by side with amazing educators like yourselves. And I do spend a lot of time internationally. So maybe I'll see you around the world one of these days. So just so happy to be here with you all and thinking about universal design for learning. All right, so I'm going to share my screen with you. This is how you can get in touch with me. I'm going to change my view here, I think. All right, are you all seeing the screen that looks like a note card? I hope you are. And I'm going to open the chat as well. All right, fantastic. So I'm really active on Twitter. Some of you may have seen me on Twitter. I'm kind of sassy about inclusion on Twitter. So sometimes I get some hate tweets sometimes, but I kind of feel like it's my job to put some thought-provoking tweets out there to keep us thinking about inclusion and universal design for learning and pushing the envelope a bit. So that's where you can find me. These are my children. Because most parents look for excuses to show their pictures of their children. But these are my kids when they were young. And gosh, they were just quick to talk, just lots of language. I think Spencer was talking in sentences before he could even walk. And Maisie too, just quick to talk. And when they got to school, they had such a difficult time learning to read. Even though my background is special education, even though I know how to deliver intervention, their reading lagged far behind where it really should have been. And you all know how this goes. Students having difficulty with something, they're seeing persistent difficulty in the classroom. And what do we say? We say they need testing. We need to figure out what's going on. And so the question I want to ask you, knowing that they had testing, knowing that children like them all over the world may have difficulty learning to read, and the response is they need testing. How much of that testing, how much of the results from that testing should be a part of making decisions about intervention or instruction or grouping in the classroom? Giving you just a moment to ponder that. How much should that matter to their test, to their instruction and intervention? And I would argue that zero, absolutely zero information that we get from that testing, from the numbers, should really have anything to do with what happens in the classroom. So thank you about analyzing tier 1 instruction. Yes. So we'll talk about that. But really nothing to do with a label should have anything to do with where a student is served, with what type of intervention is given. It's really not about that. So let's start out thinking about inclusion and what it means. In this session, we're going to be thinking about a false dichotomy that often is happening in our thoughts in education, and how that dichotomous thinking can conflict with sound educational practices and sound educational decision making, and we'll think about how universal design for learning has a solution that we can put into place to improve our decision making. So we're looking at intersections between student identity, dichotomous thinking, and universal design for learning. So the first question I'd like to give you is, what does inclusion mean to you? And as I'm asking that question, I'd love for you to put words and phrases that come to mind in the chat. And you don't even have to be thinking about school. Just what does the word inclusion mean to you? Belonging, all are welcome. All means all. Belonging, multiple pathways, all have access. Acceptance, students are welcome. Belonging, included, access, it means everything. Fairness, being allowed to, accessibility, belonging and acceptance, part of, belonging, human rights. Yes, you all, opportunities, and the list goes on and on. Getting what you need, access, everyone getting what they need. Every learner matters, voice. Yes, you all. So my good friend and mentor from the time I was 25, I think it was 25, when I met Robin McWilliam, all those years ago. And he has an adult child who, when she was in school, had an IEP. And he said, I know that she's really been included when she gets invited to the birthday parties. Yes, you all. So you all had it. You're talking about belonging, which matters, and really being included, being physically included in a classroom. That's a pretty low bar. You know, even when I think of, for those of you who are in the U.S., least restrictive environment, and for those of you who are not in the U.S., it's part of the law that says students must be in the classroom that most resembles the general education classroom, where their goals can be met or their needs can be met. That's a low bar. That part's easy. And inclusion means so much more than that. It means belonging. So let's go down a trip down memory lane to see how inclusion has evolved over the years, and think about how it looks, how it could look, what inclusion really means, before we start thinking about universal design for learning. So as a foundation for that. So when I first started teaching in a special education position, really before then, like in the 60s and early 70s, this is how it looked. Students who have IEPs are represented by the multiple colors on the outside of this white circle. And inside the circle are aqua colored dots representing students who don't have IEPs. And a long time ago, students who had IEPs didn't even get to go to school. So this prompted this grassroots movement by families saying, we want our kids to be able to go to school. So it was that grassroots movement that led ultimately to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or what it's known now as IDEA. Even after that, though, this still didn't really change a lot. My first position in the mid-90s as a special education teacher was in a school for students who had IEPs, for students who had disabilities. And the way the school kind of got around it was this school had been in place for decades as a part of this grassroots movement. So it had been started by families many years before the law was passed. And so the public school contracted with this school to say the public school was providing a free and appropriate public education. But we've figured out that's not really good enough. So then we moved along to this model. And many of you probably remember this, where students who had more significant needs were at their neighborhood schools, but often in separate classrooms for some or all of the day. And this wasn't always students who had the most significant needs. Sometimes there were classes for kids with learning disabilities, and they were separated all day long. And we still see that some. Then we've moved more to this model. And our team, we do a lot of inclusion reviews, where we're going into schools and making recommendations and pointing out strengths and ways that we can push inclusion even farther. And we see this a lot, where students who have IEPs or more significant needs are in their classrooms where they would be if they didn't have an IEP, but sometimes they're seated at a table with a paraprofessional or a one-on-one aide or a special educator. And sometimes this is happening for much of the day. So we're seeing students who have IEPs in the same classroom as peers who don't have IEPs, but sometimes not in the same space. I can remember when I was a professor going to visit student teachers. And there was this one classroom I visited, and it was elementary students. And there was this science lesson going on where they're talking about static electricity and protons and neutrons and, all the things you talk about. And they were doing this really engaging, kind of entry into this lesson where they were rubbing a balloon on everybody's heads and, how that goes. But there was a student who has Down syndrome at a different table away from this group. And the special educator was working with this child on their goals. And he just kept turning around in his chair, just dying to be a part of the lesson. Clearly, we can see that that's heartbreaking, not how it should go. But even in less extreme examples from that, being separated, it still is not necessarily inclusive. So you can be in the same space, in the same classroom, and still be excluded. It's not so much about the space as it is what's happening. So do any of those models, do any of those ways of how students are served, do any of those resonate with any of you? Do you see any of those? Do you see any of those most prominently in your school? And if you'd like, you're welcome to comment on any pros or cons or advantages or anything better that you'd like to see. So you see a lot of dependence on a paraprofessional. Yeah. And unfortunately, push in doesn't mean full access. Sometimes I do a session, it's to push or to pull. This is not the question because it really isn't about whether you push in or push or pull out, meaning it doesn't matter if you're in a large group or a small group. You can still be inclusive or exclusive. Yeah, so a lot of us are seeing the one where students are spending a good bit of time with a paraprofessional. That's one that we see a whole lot. And you see some students who are pulled out for their minutes. The word minutes is the bane to my existence. meeting the minutes or whatever, what have you. So yeah, so sometimes the students are being pulled for minutes. Yeah, so we see that kind of thing a lot. So this is relevant. So I want us to continue thinking about this a bit. This is a graphic from this new book. So close and yet so far away. You can be in the exact same classroom, but really on an island, and it can feel like an ocean away from everybody else in the classroom. Can feel very stigmatizing, as you might imagine. So is this inclusion? These graphics are borrowed from a concept from Think Inclusive, if you follow them. But is this really inclusion? At first glance, it looks like this is inclusion because we see aqua colored dots. Remember, are the students who don't have IEPs. Yes, somebody's saying, Danielle is saying not yet. And we're seeing other color dots to represent the other. So it's still that you've got this separation between students who do and don't have IEPs. Yes, students who have IEPs can be in the edges. And as we're about to talk about, students who don't have IEPs can be just as much in the edges. This thinking around the aqua dots don't have IEPs and the other color dots do have IEPs lead us to this kind of thinking. Those are your kids. These are my kids. And it's not only not inclusive language, it's not educationally sound decision-making to say, these are your kids, these are my students. So we could talk for a long time. We could think together for a long time about why that happens. And I mean, our brains are hardwired to put things into categories. That's how we make sense of information. That's why chunking and clustering work for students, is how we're hardwired. So that's kind of a natural thing that we do. However, it's not a healthy way of thinking about kids. And if you're a special educator here and you're thinking you're off the hook, you're not, because when you say my kids, it's the same thing. Even if you say my babies or my kiddos or some other endearing word after it, it still is not fully inclusive, even though it comes from really a wonderful, kind place in our hearts, that we're saying this, that we're wanting to connect the right expertise with all of our kids. So it's not really this. It's not your kids or my kids, and then my kids are your kids. It really is that all students are just students. So unfortunately, when we think about students as having an IEP, it's often attached to their identity. We're thinking about those are the special education kids. Those are your kids. We impose an identity upon students that really doesn't make a lot of sense. So to pursue this conversation a bit more, I want to ask you this, and I'm going to pause for a little bit for you to think about this. What is true for students who have IEPs that is not true for students who don't have IEPs? What's true for students who have IEPs that's not true for students who don't? Labels, that is true. They have an evaluation and a diagnosis. They have IEPs. Students with IEPs have IEPs. That's good. That is true. Specially designed instruction. That is often true, that students who have IEPs have specially designed instruction, and students who don't have IEPs sometimes don't get that. That was true when I first started teaching. As a special educator, I could only work with students who had IEPs. They have an advocate, labels, a legal accountability, accommodations. It is true. Sometimes only students who have IEPs get accommodations. We're going to think about why that shouldn't be true. Due process, modifications, same thing. Sometimes it's students who have IEPs who get those, and students who don't have IEPs don't get those. More adults involved in the process, greater accountability. All right, so did you all find this to be a hard question to answer? I find it to be a really hard question to answer, which is why I asked it. Nobody is saying that students who have IEPs have needs and students who don't have IEPs don't have needs, because that's not the way the human condition works. And a lot of this dichotomous thinking around IEPs and around what we tend to call disabilities, but I like to think of more as learning differences, learning diversity, neurodiversity. It's rooted in a U.S. definition of eligibility and eligibility criteria. And for those of you who are in other countries, it's still true. It's still true. Most of the places where I go, even in international schools, especially those rooted in American curriculum, it still does come back to this sort of eligibility criteria. So I was mentioning earlier that in the 70s, this law was passed that's now called Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And when that was passed and funded, arguably still not fully funded, but when that was funded, the government had to make decisions about where to send money and how to fund schools in order to take on this new task, this new way of educating. And to do so, they had to decide who was eligible, which kids are in, which kids are out. And so there were decisions. And so you either have a learning disability or you don't. You have dyslexia or you don't. You're on the autism spectrum or you're not. You have an intellectual disability or you don't. And if you meet the criteria, you get the label, and you get an IEP. And really, even within the field of psychology, psychiatry, it works the same way. There's a list of criteria, and if you meet enough of those criteria, you get a label or a diagnosis. But if you don't meet quite enough criteria, you don't get the label. How many of you here have ever known a student who didn't quite get the label learning disability? You can respond with yes or a why. How many of you know a student who didn't quite qualify? Well, that was an easy question to answer. Of course you do. Let's continue. How many of you know a student who didn't quite get the label autism? Yes. We all do. And yet the student who didn't quite get the label may have had the exact same needs, right? May have had the exact same needs. Fun fact, if you were in education before, so many, especially those measured, maybe had low processing speed or working memory, but didn't quite get the label. If you all are in education before 2013, you may remember something that happened in 2013, which was the definition, the criteria for getting the label autism changed. So you were not on the autism spectrum. You may not be on the autism spectrum now if you were assessed, but then you may have been on the autism spectrum if you were before. So some of you may have the label autism, or you may have that diagnosis, but if you were tested now, you may not, because the criteria changed. Did the needs change? Did the needs of the people, of the human beings change? They didn't. Just the label did. Exactly. You need to focus beyond the labels on the skills the student needs. That's exactly where we're going here. So where you live, some of you live in states where there are no categories of eligibility. That is true. Even if you're in a non-categorical state, you still have to make decisions about who gets an IEP and who doesn't. So for those of you who are, for the label intellectual disability, how do you get that label? What are the criteria for getting that label? Some of you here know, and you don't have to write a long paragraph. You can just list a criteria. So discrepancy, that comes up a good bit. Discrepancy, that used to be how we diagnosed learning disability, if you had a discrepancy between your IQ and your performance. And really, we don't do that anymore. As a field, it's not recommended anymore. Some of you are talking about lower adaptive scores. So you've got an effect. There's an effect to your adaptive functioning and to your educational performance. And you all are hitting the nail on the head. Everybody knows or has heard that it's this IQ test. This IQ test comes into play in determining whether you have this label. Now, I'll start out by saying IQ is not a great measure. We use it, but you have to take it with a grain of salt. It's not useful for all populations. It's certainly not a great measure for determining needs or even outcomes. So some of you are saying IQ score and a certain number of standard deviations. So so some are saying 2.5 standard deviations below the mean. And usually that is the case. So it's usually the case that it's 2 standard deviations below the mean. So in most places where you go, that's the rule. If you have an IQ score 2 standard deviations below the mean and you meet the other criteria, you're in. You get the IEP and all of the rights that pertain thereto. So on most IQ tests, the mean score is 100. The standard deviation is 15. So 100 minus 15 minus 15, all the math teachers know, that's a 70. So if you have an IQ score of 68, you're in. If you have an IQ score, though, of 72, even if you meet all the other criteria, you're not in. You don't get an IEP. You don't get those special rights. unless you move to Vermont. If you move to Vermont and some other places, the cutoff is 1.5 standard deviations below the mean. So if you have an IQ score of 72 and you move from Kentucky, where I live, and you don't have an intellectual disability, but you move to Vermont, now you have that. Did the needs change? Just the geography changed. Just the geography changed. All this to say, it doesn't make sense to make decisions about intervention, about grouping, about instruction, about placement, based on whether you have an IEP or not. Doesn't make sense to base it on any kind of label. What makes sense to base those decisions on are your needs. That's what makes sense. Testing is not a panacea. It does not offer the information that we need. And a lot of times as teachers, we feel like, oh, we need testing. We need an expert involved to tell us what to do. Classroom teachers, you've got the answers. You've got the power. You know your students best, and you already know their strengths and their needs. And having a document that gives us a label can be useful. It can determine if a student qualifies and give us a basis of understanding of why maybe that we might be seeing a learning difference, but it's not what gives us, it's not the information that is going to help us know what to do. You can also have the exact same need. Two of these students might have the exact same need. One of them has dyslexia and one doesn't, but they might have the exact same needs in terms of writing, for example. Sometimes whether you get an IEP or not depends on why. So if you have a neurological reason or a reason that you were born with, you often will qualify for an IEP that a person with the exact same needs but doesn't have the same origin won't qualify. So for example, you may have students who have difficulty learning to read. So you've got students like both of my children who have a lot of difficulty learning to read. Turns out they both have dyslexia, and so they qualified. They were able to get an IEP, specially designed instruction, all of the rights that you're afforded if you have an IEP. What are some other reasons that you might have trouble learning to read that are not dyslexia? Got some clues here for you. Thank you, Tiffany, for reminding us that teachers do have the power and they have what they need, especially when we're on awesome teams and can bring all of our experience and expertise together, and we don't need a paper with a list. Yeah, so lots of reasons. Look at this. Look at all of these reasons that a student might be behind with reading. So it may be that the student's new to the language of instruction. It may be that they need vision support. It may be that they've experienced trauma. And I always bring this part up because you know a lot of students in your schools who've experienced trauma. And we also know that during COVID, a lot of students experience all kinds of trauma. We're seeing anxiety and lots of effects on learning because of trauma. And I want to remind us, very similar to what Arvin is saying here, and I hope I pronounced your name correctly, but the ACEs, and you all may know about this, adverse childhood events. There are students in our schools who've experienced trauma and will never, ever know about it. So you have kids in your classroom, in your schools, who are having difficulty learning, and it is completely about trauma, and you'll never even know it. And many of those students, they don't get an IEP. They don't qualify for an IEP. Trauma is not a category for how you qualify. So sometimes students with the most significant needs don't even qualify. And yet you might get an IEP or not get an IEP based on just why. So all this to say, the dichotomy is fake. You have a need or you don't have a need. This, you have a label or you don't have a label. It's really it's a fake, it's a false dichotomy. And if you took, if you were ever in a debate group or took debate in school, or have taken a logic class, you'll know about false dichotomies. And that's really what we're causing by thinking about students having labels or not. So this is really inclusion. We all have strengths. We all have needs. Every dot is a different color. And some of those needs are more significant than others. Some of the strengths or needs are long-term or short-term or require more support, but that doesn't run along the same lines as whether you have a label or not. We can't say automatically that a student who has a label has more significant needs than a student who doesn't. By the time my children were in high school, they no longer needed intervention. Intervention works. They got intervention early. They got it at a sufficient dosage. And by the time they were in high school, voracious readers love reading, love it to this day. And yet there were students in their high schools who had really significant needs in language and literacy who didn't qualify. Special education is not a place. And we've heard this platitude: special education is not a place, it's a service. And that is true. It shouldn't be a place. It should be a support, a service that we provide. And those people who provide special education services have expertise in intervention strategies that can benefit everybody, can benefit a lot of students, whether or not there's a label. So, important lesson here. Special education is not an identity. Now, we do know within the deaf community, there are many people who say, I'm a deaf person, capitalize that D, I'm a deaf person. And if you are a part of this webinar right now, you may, and are deaf, you may be saying exactly that. Put the deaf before my name, capitalize it. And the same is happening with the autism community. There are a lot of people who say that is my identity. That is who I am. It's a part of my culture. This is who I am. Nobody says I'm a special education person. That's not an identity. That's an identity that we impose upon our students. It's not an identity. It's not who someone is. It's what they receive. So I'm going to challenge you to listen for that prickly language in the upcoming weeks. Do you hear people say special education student? That's my student. That's their student. Yes, the individual decides, Sandy is exactly correct, if they want to use identity first language or person first language. That is up to the individual, just like any of us communicates and determines how we identify. That is up to the individual person. Exactly. We don't want to impose an identity, and we certainly don't want to impose a service as an identity onto a person. So there really are no special education kids. There's special education services, but there are no special education kids. Everybody in the building is a general education student. They're all, a part of the school community. There happen to be some students who benefit from special education services or special education expertise. And that expertise can benefit everybody in the school. Thank you, Maybell. Maybell, you're telling me to preach. There are no IEP kids. This language bothers me particularly. Now we're saying a kid is a document. The kid is that we're saying the identity of the kid is a document. So in the first one, we're saying the identity of the kid is a service. And now we're saying the identity of a kid is their document. So I encourage you to help people correct themselves when they say special education kid or IEP kid. There really are no even tier 2 or tier 3 kids. This really goes completely against the whole spirit of MTSS or RTI, in which you flow in and out of the tiers of instruction and intervention based on what you need at that time. If it's what you need at that time, it is not an identity. All right, so all of that language, it's not inclusion, it's not inclusive, it's language that divides. All kids are just kids. All students are just students. All students, general education students, every one of them. So what does universal design for learning have to offer us in responding to this truth that there is no dichotomy and that we should be making decisions based on what students need instead of a label? You may have read the book, The End of Average by Todd Rose. I encourage you to, if you haven't. And in this book, Todd talks about the jagged learner profile, how we all have strengths, we all have needs. We used to think of students a long time ago as being the low performing students, the middle performing students, and the high flyers. And that's not the way it works either. We all have strengths, we all have needs. The student, his TED Talk is superb. I would make his slides a little more diverse, representative of diversity. But yes, the TED Talk is superb. And we both serve on the advisory committee for the Mastery Transcript Consortium. Really, really great guy, smart guy, who's really thoughtful about this sort of variation. So we all have strengths, we all have needs, and even the student who is getting all A's, knocking it out of the park, high GPA, might have some of the most significant needs. So we don't make decisions about a whole individual. This whole person is high performing. This whole person is low performing, because that's not the way it works. We all have strengths and we all have needs. Variation is normal. Needs are universal. And what's great is how when we all come together, we have all the strengths. When we all come together as a group, we have all the strengths. So it doesn't make sense to design our instruction to the middle. When we do that in this graphic, none of the points are in the middle. And we miss everything that's to the edges. So instead, we want to design our instruction to the edges. When we have a student in our class who's terrified of math, they're like, I'm just not good at math. I'm not a math person. We want to design our lessons with that kid in mind. How do I make it engaging? How do I give that student some success so they believe they can do this? They see themselves as the math person. And as soon as you do that, you've designed it for everybody to feel that way. So we want to think about each student, the strengths, the needs, and design the lesson with that in mind. And as soon as we do, we get everybody. All right, so this is a ramp that we see all around us. We see these curb cuts, ramps, and if you use a wheelchair, you know this, you can't get around town easily without these. They're required. It's just about necessary that you have this to get around town if you use a wheelchair. Who in here has ever benefited from a ramp? We all have. When have you benefited from a ramp? What were you doing? When you're a new parent, you were probably pushing a stroller or a pram, pushing a grocery cart, baby stroller, dragging luggage. Yes, on and on and on. The most creative answer I got was, and you can give me a better one and I'll use it from now on, but the best one I ever got was short dogs benefit from these ramps. So next question is, who benefits more often? People who use wheelchairs or people who don't? People who don't use wheelchairs benefit more often. There are more people who don't use wheelchairs than do. So people who don't use wheelchairs benefit more often. The analogy here is to challenge us to find more ramps and curb cuts in our instruction. What can we put into place in our everyday instruction that's just about required if you have this label or this need or that need that really can benefit everybody? So what's necessary for some is good for all. If you want to learn more about universal design for learning, this is the primary source. So if you browse to udlguidelines.cast.org, it will take you to this table and a whole website where you can learn all about universal design for learning if you'd like to continue in that way. So I'm going to give you an example. With universal design for learning, we might associate an image with a concept. So I might attach an image. I've attached some images today, like just now. I gave you the image of the ramp to associate with this concept. And I used an analogy to help you remember or to process that concept. And then we can take it, we can level it up. We can teach kids to create their own mental images for remembering. And so I'm going to give you an example. Have you ever been in the shower and you had something you wanted to remember and to put on your to-do list? And, whether you use an old-fashioned to-do list or you put it in your phone, kind of hard to do when you're in the shower. And so I was in the shower and I was like, oh, okay, I need to pick up stamps. Oh, I need help with my San Diego State login. I need to get my car tags renewed. Oh, I need to pick up some magic erasers. Well, who's going to remember all four of those things that you've got to pick up without writing it down? Well, I've learned that you can create an image. So I created a mental image for myself right then that helped me remember that list. So I drew a log kind of in my head, needing help with my login. So I drew a log to help me remember that. And I'm like, okay, I need to remember stamps. So on the log, I drew in my mind an image of a stamp. Got to pick up the stamps. And I needed to get my car tags renewed. So I decided, okay, I'm going to put the log on top of a car. And then I need magic erasers. So I'm going to give the log a magic wand so I remember the magic erasers. So that's just such a simple example of how we can help with memory retrieval. And using images in this way are often necessary if you have certain needs, but really everybody can benefit from that simple strategy for memory retrieval. So these are some things that we're using every day, whether you know about universal design for learning or not. We're using all of these examples. We see these in classrooms all around us. Many of them, like mnemonics, like pairing images, graphic organizers, those largely have their roots in special education research, but we know that now that they just work for everybody. It's not the same as differentiation, though. With differentiation, I'm making decisions about the students I have in my class right now based on what those needs are. Universal design for learning, though, is when we presume there is going to be variation. We know every year we're going to have a student who hates math and sees that they're not a good math person and doesn't have a lot of confidence there. So it's not going to be a surprise. It's not a surprise when we have students who love getting lost in a book and we have students who don't feel very confident as readers. Every year we're going to have that variation. So why not build in the accommodations and supports we need on the front end? These buildings are old buildings, and let's say that they're not accessible. They don't have elevators. They don't have ramps. It's going to be really expensive and difficult to add those. And it may just not even be possible. And sometimes that happens to us too. Like we're in the middle of a unit, we're in the middle of a lesson, we're needing to differentiate, we're needing to add something, take away something, change something, but the train's left the station and it's hard to do in the moment. And sometimes we don't do it as well as we could if we planned ahead of time. UDL is not a box to check. It's not that we check off all of those strategies that I shared earlier or all of the ones in the table. It's a different way of thinking. It's a way of thinking about iterating our lessons, the awesome instruction that we're already delivering. I finished that lesson today. What am I going to add to it? What worked for students? What didn't work? What could have worked better? And thinking of it with the tenets, with the principles of UDL in mind, as we think about how am I going to engage students differently next time? How am I going to represent content in more ways next time? How am I going to invite ways of expression in different ways next time? So it's a way of thinking, of designing to the edges. UDL functions like accommodations, not like modifications. So it is really important that we understand the difference in the functions. We hear the words all the time. These are accommodations. Those are modifications. I'm going to give you a list here. Extended time, answering verbally instead of in writing, taking away part of the questions, and reading the questions to a student instead of their reading the questions. Which of these do you think, just think to yourself, which of these are accommodations? Carrie already says, great accommodations. So the old language around this is accommodations don't change the expectation. Modifications do. Ooh, Elda gave us something to think about. It depends on what the standard is. You know, and all of them might be accommodations. You're right on. No matter how you answered, you got this right. And you got this right because it depends on what you're measuring, or it depends on what your target is. And every single one of these is an accommodation every single time, except this person is wearing glasses during a driver's exam. So we're supporting vision, but we're measuring driving. Accommodations are anytime you support something other than what you're measuring, other than your target, every single time. If I don't let this person wear glasses, am I able to even measure driving? I can't even measure it. So it's not only about fairness, it's about measurement validity. I can't even measure what I'm trying to measure if I don't allow it. If I don't allow a student to have accommodations, whether or not they have a label or anything written in a 504 or an IEP, I've compromised the validity of my assessment. I haven't administered a valid assessment if I don't allow that, regardless of what a sheet of paper says. Modifications, on the other hand, are support for exactly what you're measuring. So if you wore your glasses during an eye exam, that would be the one time where wearing your glasses would be a modification. It's the only time that would be a modification. So if we look back at our examples here, extended time is an accommodation every single time unless we're measuring speed or rate, and we almost should never be. We should almost never do that. Answering in with words, verbal words, instead of in writing is an accommodation every single time unless we're measuring writing. And then you have to ask, is it the physical act of writing, or is voice to text okay? You have to get at really what are we trying to measure. Taking away part of the questions, some of the questions, is an accommodation, as long as they're all the same skill and all equal difficulty. Taking away part of them is an accommodation unless you're measuring stamina or how many questions you can answer. Reading the questions to a student instead of having them read the questions is an accommodation every single time unless you're measuring decoding. So almost anything that we're doing is an accommodation. It's accommodation all the time, except in one instance. Is it an accommodation? In all of those, it's an accommodation, except for this one time. Meaning, if it's functioning as an accommodation, we can just build it in as universal design. We can put it into every assessment, every lesson, all of our instruction, everything we're doing can include all of the options as accommodations on the front end, which makes them universal design. And the more we do of this, the fewer accommodations and modifications we have to add later, the less we have to try to do to those buildings to make them accessible. All right, these are chocolate chip cookies. One more analogy and image here. It's really easy to put the chocolate into the cookies before you bake them. It's really hard to do this after you bake the cookies. Arguably, if we're not using universal design for learning, we're not implementing MTSS. You have to be putting into place universal design for learning as tier 1 before you can say there was a need for intervention. So we have to be doing that first. All right, you've seen these graphics before where you move the boxes around and so forth. So I'm gonna give another analogy here. So this is inequitable. Everybody gets the same number of boxes. Everybody gets one box. That doesn't work. This is like an accommodation when we move the boxes around in the moment to make sure everybody can see over. This is universal. Just take down the fence. And as soon as you take down the fence, you don't have to go back and move the boxes around each time. It's more efficient. You take the fence down. When we do that, we remove the stigma of even needing an accommodation because it's available to everybody. All right, pop quiz. This is a set of elevator buttons. We're on the bottom floor, so both elevator buttons go up. There's a lower button, presumably for people who use wheelchairs. Is this universal design? Got some people quick on the draw to say no. Why is it not universal design? It's accessible, right? It is accessible. Yes, you don't need two buttons. You only need the bottom button. Is it only people who use wheelchairs that benefit from the lower button? Who else benefits? Who likes to push the buttons the most? Yes, you got it. So everybody can use the lower button, and you don't need to announce to people who use wheelchairs that they can use that button. They already know. They don't need us to tell them. They know they can use the lower button. You do still need the Braille, but you don't need to announce that the lower button's for those. All right, so what are some examples from today's slides that are universal design? Text and images paired together. Images, metaphors. Visuals, high contrast. Analogies. What do you notice about the text? I'm reading out loud. Captions are enabled. Big font. Yeah, you got it. Big font. One word. So I've got keywords instead of all the bullet points and such. Yes, you got it. So I'm pairing images, text, speaking, familiar images representing concepts, analogies, not too much text, visual contrast, larger text. You got it. All right. So just for fun, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions. Just for fun, who can remember what I needed to do when I had to make that list in the shower? That strategy is a strategy we can teach kids. I needed stamps, login, tag renewal. You already got it. Magic eraser. You all got it. And you got it just because I drew that mental image that we can teach kids to use when they have to remember a list of things. So you got it. You remembered this. And you know what? You remembered it even without my showing you this. You remembered it. You had the mental image of this, and that's the way it works. So we want to open all the doors with universal design for learning. And we do that by designing to the edges, because student support, special education, the service is not an identity. There aren't my kids, there aren't your kids, and students don't belong to student support or to special education, but rather every student in the building belongs to all of us. We've got about 5 minutes. Hit us with your best questions.
Lee Ann, would you mind if you stop sharing screen while we do questions?
I sure will.
Here you are. Thank you. Feel free to put questions in the chat if you have them.
Yeah, that's I guess probably one of the most common questions. Where do you start? That whole list, that table is enormous. How do we get started with that? The beautiful thing about universal design for learning is, one, we can help everybody see that they're already succeeding with it. They're already having successes. The examples I just gave you of how we represent content in a lot of different ways. If we were to go to any classroom, we would be seeing multiple means of representation. Does that mean that there's always more to add? Absolutely. I try to think of more images. I spend a lot of time picking out pictures and arranging images, and we can always all be doing that. But we're all already having a lot of success with that. And again, UDL is not about checking off all of those elements within the table. It's saying, hey, where am I struggling with engaging kids? Let me take a look at this table. Let me take a look at this list of strategies and see which one might I give a try. So it's an on-ramp, right? You can start anywhere, and it's very accessible because we're already having some successes. It's just about what else can I add? How best can you support shadow teachers stepping back? And for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, it's the same as paraprofessional, one-on-one assistant. Carrie, we could spend a whole webinar on that. I'm trying to think, how do I distill that very quickly? Okay, so the analogy I give for that, if you're a basketball fan, if you're not, find a friend who is. The analogy I give for that is to use zone defense instead of one-on-one, zone defense instead of man-to-man defense. So if that person who's there to support a student is specially trained and knows how to support that student, but is floating around the room, supporting groups of students and flowing between, so they're not so Velcroed to an individual student, we can reduce the harm that does result from Velcroing in that way. I believe it's going to be available to be viewed again at another time. About assessments being used or not being used in designing intervention. How can we make good use of the data already shared through those psychoeducational reports? Honestly, I think a lot of those reports are very useful in determining eligibility and getting some understanding of the why, but it's the everyday classroom assessments, formal and informal, that really give us the best information on how do we intervene, how do we design instruction, how do we group. So that's really the most valuable assessment that you have. And a lot of times we feel like these more formal assessments, even our more formal classroom assessments, are more valid, and that's not really the case. The way you know your students the best is walking around, talking to them, leaning over their shoulder, interacting with them, conferring with them. So have some confidence in what you know about kids. I think we're out of time. Is that true, Melissa?
If you have time and want to answer any more of these questions, we're not going to get cut off from the internet, right at 4:30. I'm sure some people will need to log off, but it's up to you. If we've got, I know there's a lot of juicy questions here.
There are. How about helping parents understand? Some people feel their child is not getting services unless they're being pulled out. Oh. That is tricky. And that's similar in the same vein. You might have families really advocating for, I want my child to have a one-on-one assistant. My child has the right to that. I think what we always have to remember is that families will sometimes advocate for things that maybe aren't in line with best practice as we know it. And, we're all in agreement that we all want good things for kids, so they want great things for their kids. We want great things for their kids. And so it's just a matter of working together to make sure that everybody understands the harm and the benefit of different service delivery models, because there are differences. If you check out the book, that's the Seen, Heard, and Valued book, I do share examples of how we can provide small group intervention that is not necessarily embedded within a large group, within the large classroom, but it's still not pulled out. It's not pulled out separate. It's still inclusive. You can deliver supports and intervention to a small group of students. And it's just that if IEP isn't your passport to get in, and you're not interrupting tier 1 instruction, then that is inclusive support. So I hope you enjoy that part of the book for a little bit more on the logistics of that and a visual for that.
Thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you, Lee Ann. This was a wonderful session.
Thanks for the invitation. Have a good day.